You know what the funny part is? Preston Vale said in Japanese, swirling a glass of 20-year bourbon beneath the golden lights of the rooftop restaurant. The billionaire sitting across from us has no idea he's about to lose his own company. The men around him chuckled softly. Not loudly. Men like them never laughed loudly in places that charged $400 for a steak. Their amusement came in smirks, in loosened ties, in the confidence of people who believed the room belonged to them. And standing just 3 feet away, quietly pouring sparkling water into crystal glasses, Naomi Brooks heard every single word. The Skyline room sat 42 stories above Manhattan, wrapped in glass and city lights. Below, yellow cabs crawled through wet streets while helicopters blinked across the night sky like distant stars. Inside, money moved differently. Softer. Deadlier. The marble floors reflected the amber glow of hanging chandeliers, and every table carried the scent of imported cedar candles and $1,000 perfume. This was not a restaurant people visited for food. This was where billion-dollar decisions were made between bites of Wagyu and whispered lies. At the center of the private dining room sat Alexander Whitmore, founder and CEO of Whitmore Global Capital. 39 years old. Silver cufflinks. Navy-tailored suit. Calm blue eyes that rarely revealed what he was thinking. Forbes called him one of the most ruthless investment minds in America. Financial magazines described him as surgical, cold, untouchable. Tonight, however, Alexander looked tired. The kind of tired money could not fix. Because sitting across from him was Kenji Nakamura, the legendary Japanese CEO behind Nakamura Robotics, and the contract resting between them was worth nearly $900 million. One signature would change the future of Whitmore Global forever. Cameras were not allowed in the room. Phones were sealed in black velvet pouches by security downstairs. Privacy was part of the luxury, which meant nobody outside these walls would ever know how close Alexander Whitmore came to being betrayed by the men sitting beside him. Preston Vale leaned back in his chair, confidence dripping from every movement. Younger than Alexander by nearly 10 years, Preston had climbed Whitmore Global's corporate ladder faster than anyone in company history. Smart, charming, dangerous. He wore arrogance the way rich men wore watches. Casually. Nakamura will sign anything if the translation sounds respectful enough, Preston continued in Japanese under his breath. By tomorrow morning, Whitmore won't even realize the licensing rights are gone. Another executive nearly choked trying not to laugh. Across the table, Kenji Nakamura remained unreadable, his expression calm behind thin silver glasses. Alexander noticed none of it. He was busy reviewing numbers on the final contract, while servers moved quietly through the room like shadows trained not to exist. And that was exactly what Naomi Brooks had learned to become. Invisible. At 27 years old, Naomi worked double shifts 6 nights a week at the Skyline room. Guests rarely looked directly at her unless they needed something. Refill the wine. Bring another napkin. Smile more. She had heard every version of disrespect polished into corporate language. Tonight was no different. Preston snapped his fingers lightly without even turning toward her. Sweetheart, more water. Naomi walked forward silently, her black uniform pressed perfectly, natural curls tied neatly behind her head. Her posture stayed straight even as exhaustion burned through her feet after 11 straight hours on shift. She reached toward Preston's glass carefully. That was when he smirked at the men beside him and spoke again in Japanese. Careful. She probably thinks we're complimenting her. A few men laughed into their drinks. Small laughs. Coward laughs. The kind people use when they want approval more than dignity. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the tablecloth, but inside, something tightened quietly in her chest. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Recognition. Because she had heard voices like Preston's her entire life. Voices that assumed intelligence had a certain skin color. Voices that mistook silence for ignorance. And across the room, beneath the soft glow of Manhattan's skyline, Naomi Brooks made a decision that would change every life sitting at that table before the night was over. Naomi stepped away from the table slowly, but her mind stayed locked onto every word Preston Vale had spoken. Years of working inside luxury restaurants had taught her something wealthy people never realized. The richer the room, the more dangerous the whispers. Men who smiled for magazine covers often revealed their true selves when they believed the staff was invisible. And tonight, Preston had said too much. The Skyline room continued moving around them like an expensive machine built from silence and ego. Servers floated between tables carrying dry-aged steaks plated with edible gold, lobster flown in that morning from Maine, and bottles of Burgundy older than some of the assistants seated against the wall. Jazz hummed softly through hidden speakers while rain tapped against the glass windows overlooking Manhattan. Everything looked polished, controlled, but Naomi could feel tension spreading beneath the surface like a crack beneath ice. Alexander Whitmore loosened his tie slightly while studying the final pages of the agreement. He had spent the last 8 months chasing this deal. Everyone on Wall Street knew it. Whitmore Global had lost nearly $200 million the previous year after a failed expansion into Europe, and investors were watching him carefully now. Another mistake could destroy confidence in the company overnight, which was exactly why tonight mattered so much. Kenji Nakamura folded his hands calmly near the contract folder. Unlike the Americans at the table, he spoke very little. His silence carried weight instead of discomfort. Naomi noticed how carefully he watched people before responding, almost as if he measured character the same way other men measured profit margins. Preston, however, mistook patience for weakness. "Mr. Nakamura," Preston said with a polished smile, switching back to English. "Whitmore Global is prepared to move immediately once signatures are complete." Kenji nodded politely. "Trust is very important in business," he replied softly. "Especially international business." Preston smiled wider. "Of course." But Naomi saw it. The flicker in Preston's eyes. Too quick for most people to catch. Panic disguised as confidence. Because trust was exactly what Preston planned to exploit. Naomi moved toward the side station near the wall, pretending to organize fresh glasses while she listened carefully. She had learned Japanese 15 years ago in a tiny apartment above a laundromat in Brooklyn. Her mother had worked 2 jobs cleaning office buildings, while Naomi spent evenings with Mrs. Sato, the elderly Japanese widow living downstairs. Mrs. Sato taught her language through old movies, handwritten flashcards, and bowls of miso soup eaten beside a flickering television. Naomi had fallen in love with the rhythm of the language long before she understood how useful it would become. Back then, it was survival, an escape from the noise outside their apartment windows. Now it was something else entirely. A weapon hidden in plain sight. Across the room, Preston leaned toward another executive and muttered quietly in Japanese again. Once Whitmore signs, the robotics patents transfer through the Singapore shell company before he notices. Naomi froze for half a second behind the champagne station. Her stomach tightened instantly. Patents. Shell company. Transfer. This was not corporate greed anymore. This was betrayal carefully wrapped inside legal language. She looked toward Alexander. He still had no idea. He trusted Preston completely. That much was obvious in the way he allowed him to lead parts of the negotiation. The realization hit Naomi harder than she expected. Because Alexander Whitmore might have been rich, distant, and emotionally unreadable, but he was not cruel. Not like Preston. Earlier that night, Alexander had quietly thanked a dishwasher carrying broken trays near the kitchen entrance. Naomi had noticed because powerful men rarely noticed anyone beneath them. But Preston noticed everyone, especially people he believed were weaker. "Hey." Preston suddenly called across the room without looking directly at her. "More wine over here." Naomi grabbed the bottle immediately and walked back toward the table with calm, measured steps. Her heartbeat thudded harder now beneath the surface of her composure. As she poured the dark red wine into Preston's glass, he smirked again and spoke in Japanese one more time, low enough that Alexander could not hear. Amazing how people can stand this close to power and still never understand what is happening. Naomi finished pouring carefully. Then she lifted her eyes for the first time that night and looked directly at Preston Vale. For one brief second, Preston Vale stopped smiling. It was small, almost invisible. But Naomi saw it clearly because people only revealed their real selves when control slipped unexpectedly from their hands. The restaurant noise continued around them. Soft jazz drifting beneath conversations worth more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. But something at the table had shifted. Preston felt it too. Naomi straightened slowly after pouring the wine, her expression calm, unreadable. Then, in perfect Japanese, quiet enough that only the executives at the table could hear, she said, "Some people stand close to power for so long that they forget honesty matters more than position." The air vanished from the room. Preston's fingers tightened around his glass instantly. One executive nearly dropped his fork onto the white tablecloth. Across from them, Kenji Nakamura lifted his eyes sharply for the first time all evening. But the person most stunned was Alexander Whitmore. His head turned toward Naomi slowly, almost cautiously, as if his mind needed an extra second to process what he had just heard. Because moments earlier, she had simply been another server in a black uniform. Another invisible face moving between expensive plates and richer people. And now suddenly, the entire gravity of the room had changed direction. Preston recovered first. Men like him always tried to recover quickly. Interesting, he said in English with a forced laugh. Looks like our waitress has hidden talents. Naomi met his eyes calmly. People usually do. Kenji Nakamura leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with visible curiosity now. Your Japanese is impressive, he said softly. Naomi nodded politely. Thank you, sir. Preston chuckled under his breath and reached for his drink. Well, this is Manhattan, he said. Everyone speaks something these days. But Naomi noticed the faint sweat forming near his temple despite the cold air conditioning flowing through the private room. Because Preston understood something Alexander still did not. Naomi had heard everything. Alexander looked toward her again, this time not as staff, but as a person carrying information. Real information. Valuable information. Where did you learn Japanese? He asked quietly. Naomi hesitated for half a second, not because she was nervous, because she understood that answers changed how people saw you. An elderly woman named Mrs. Sato taught me when I was growing up in Brooklyn, she replied. She used to say language lets you hear the truth people try to hide. Kenji smiled faintly at that. A real smile. The first one anyone had seen from him all night. Preston noticed it immediately, and panic flashed across his face before disappearing again behind corporate confidence. Well, Preston interrupted quickly. I think we should focus on finalizing the agreement before dessert arrives. He slid the contract folder slightly closer toward Alexander. Too quickly, too eagerly. Naomi watched Alexander glance down toward the paperwork again. The signature page rested neatly on top, waiting. One pen stroke away from disaster. Her heartbeat grew heavier inside her chest now. She had spent years surviving by staying quiet. Quiet employees kept their jobs. Quiet women avoided trouble. Quiet people got ignored instead of attacked. But sometimes silence protected the wrong people. Across the table, Kenji Nakamura reached for his tea slowly while observing Preston with new caution. The room no longer felt relaxed. It felt loaded. Like everyone sensed something invisible sitting between the wine glasses and polished silverware. Naomi could walk away right now. She could finish her shift, collect her tips, ride the subway home, and let wealthy men destroy each other with their own greed. None of this belonged to her world anyway. But then she looked at Alexander Whitmore again. At the exhaustion in his eyes. At the trust he still placed in the people sitting beside him. And suddenly Naomi remembered her mother standing in front of broken elevators cleaning office buildings at midnight, while businessmen walked past her without ever saying thank you. She remembered Mrs. Sato telling her, "Character is what you do when silence would be easier." Preston opened the contract folder completely now and slid a silver pen across the table toward Alexander. "Congratulations," he said smoothly. "Tonight changes everything." Naomi stared at the papers for one long breath. Then her eyes locked onto a single line buried deep inside the English translation, and the blood drained from her face. The sentence sat there quietly in black ink, almost invisible beneath layers of polished legal language and corporate terminology. Most people at the table would never have noticed it. That was the point. Naomi stared at the English translation while her pulse hammered inside her chest. Exclusive international licensing rights transferred permanently upon execution of agreement. Permanently. But 30 minutes earlier, Preston had joked in Japanese that Alexander would not realize the patents were gone until morning. Gone. Not shared. Not temporary. Gone forever. Naomi lifted her eyes slowly toward the Japanese version resting beside Kenji Nakamura's hand. The wording was completely different. Temporary licensing partnership pending future review. The room suddenly felt colder. The jazz music faded beneath the sound of her own breathing. Someone had altered the English contract. Not a typo. Not a misunderstanding. A setup. Alexander uncapped the silver pen carefully, exhaustion weighing behind his eyes. Around the table, executives leaned forward slightly, sensing the deal finally reaching its conclusion. $900 million. Months of negotiations. Endless flights between New York and Tokyo. And now everything balanced on one signature. Preston smiled too quickly. "This is a historic moment," he said smoothly. Whitmore Global and Nakamura Robotics together will dominate the market for the next decade. Kenji Nakamura remained silent, watching, measuring. Naomi noticed his fingers resting lightly against the Japanese documents, as if even he sensed something shifting beneath the surface. Alexander lowered the pen toward the paper. Naomi moved before fear could stop her. "Sir," she said softly. The single word cut through the room sharper than shouting. Alexander paused immediately, pen hovering above the contract. Every head turned toward her. Preston's expression darkened instantly. "Excuse me," he said coldly. Naomi swallowed carefully, aware that one wrong sentence could cost her job before midnight. But some truths became too heavy to carry silently. "I think there may be a problem with the translation," she said. Silence hit the table like a sudden storm. Preston laughed first, loud enough this time for everyone to hear. "Are we seriously stopping a $900 million deal because the waitress suddenly became a lawyer?" A few executives shifted awkwardly in their seats. Nobody laughed with him now. Alexander looked at Naomi carefully, really carefully. "What kind of problem?" he asked. Naomi glanced toward the contract. "The Japanese version and the English version are saying different things regarding the patent rights." Preston leaned back hard in his chair. "That is ridiculous." But his voice cracked slightly on the final word. Kenji Nakamura slowly reached for the English copy while adjusting his glasses. The older man began reading line by line, his calm expression tightening almost immediately. Across the table, one of the Japanese attorneys leaned forward quickly beside him. Their quiet conversation in Japanese grew faster with every sentence. Preston's confidence started dissolving visibly now. Sweat formed along his forehead despite the cool Manhattan night pressing against the windows outside. "There must be some misunderstanding," he interrupted sharply. "Legal teams reviewed everything weeks ago." Naomi held her ground. "Then why does the English version transfer permanent ownership rights while the Japanese version describes a temporary partnership?" The room froze completely. One executive actually lowered his wine glass without drinking because his hand had started shaking. Alexander turned slowly toward Preston now. Not confused anymore. Focused. Dangerous in an entirely different way. "Is that true?" he asked quietly. Preston forced out another laugh, weaker this time. "Alexander, come on. You are going to trust a server over your own chief financial officer." Naomi felt every eye in the room land on her at once. The black waitress. The invisible woman carrying water glasses 10 minutes earlier. Suddenly standing between billionaires and disaster. But before Alexander could respond, Kenji Nakamura closed the contract folder firmly and spoke in calm, perfect English. "No," he said quietly. "Tonight we are deciding whether we can trust any of you at all." Nobody touched their food after that. The steaks cooled untouched beneath soft golden lights while Manhattan glittered outside the windows like a city pretending it had never seen corruption before. Inside the private dining room, however, the atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier that night, the room belonged to Preston Vale. Now it belonged to silence. Alexander Whitmore sat perfectly still with the silver pen resting beside his hand. The same contract that had looked like victory 15 minutes earlier now sat on the table like evidence in a courtroom. Kenji Nakamura continued reviewing both versions carefully with his legal advisor, their low Japanese conversation sharp with concern. Across the table, Preston tried to regain control of the situation, but panic was beginning to crack through his polished corporate image. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. "Translation discrepancies happen in international business all the time." Naomi remained standing quietly near the table, but she could feel every eye in the room studying her differently now. Earlier, they had looked through her. Now they were trying to figure out who she really was. Alexander finally spoke, his voice calm enough to make the room even more uncomfortable. "Are you telling me permanent ownership rights accidentally appeared in one version of a $900 million agreement?" Preston opened his mouth quickly. Too quickly. "Legal teams handled the drafts. I trusted the process." Alexander's expression did not change, but something colder settled behind his eyes. "That is not what I asked you." The rain outside grew heavier, tapping softly against the glass walls 42 floors above Manhattan. Somewhere below them, taxis rushed through flooded streets while ordinary people hurried home from ordinary jobs. But up here, careers, reputations, and entire companies were beginning to collapse in real time. Kenji Nakamura slowly removed his glasses and folded them neatly beside his plate. "In Japan," he said quietly, Trust is considered part of the contract even when it is not written on paper. Nobody interrupted him. If this agreement had been signed tonight, he continued, my company would have believed your company acted dishonorably. His eyes shifted toward Alexander. And perhaps you would have believed the same about us later. Alexander nodded once, slowly absorbing the weight of that truth. Because this was larger than stolen patents now. This could have destroyed international relationships, investor confidence, and Whitmore Global itself. All because someone at the table believed greed was smarter than integrity. Preston laughed nervously again, but the sound fell flat this time. Come on, Alexander. We are really going to pretend she uncovered some conspiracy because she speaks Japanese? Naomi felt the insult land softly in the room. Familiar. Predictable. The kind of sentence people used when they wanted to shrink someone back into invisibility. But Alexander did not even look at Preston this time. His attention stayed on Naomi. Did you understand everything being said tonight? He asked quietly. Naomi hesitated, then nodded once. Most of it. Including the part about the shell company? Preston's face lost color instantly. A sharp silence slammed into the table. One executive lowered his eyes toward his drink immediately, unwilling to be connected to what was happening anymore. Naomi spoke carefully. You mentioned transferring the licensing rights through a Singapore account before morning. Preston pushed his chair back suddenly, anger replacing fear. This is insane. But Alexander's voice stopped him cold. Sit down. It was not loud. That was what made it dangerous. Preston slowly lowered himself back into the chair, stunned. Alexander Whitmore had spent years building a reputation as one of the calmest men on Wall Street. He rarely raised his voice, rarely lost control, but everyone in the room could feel something changing now beneath that composure. Betrayal always sounded louder when it came from someone sitting beside you. Alexander turned toward Naomi again, and for the first time that night, there was something unfamiliar in his expression. Not authority, not distance. Respect. Real respect. You just saved my company from signing away hundreds of millions of dollars, he said quietly. Naomi lowered her eyes slightly. I was only trying to stop a mistake. Kenji Nakamura shook his head softly. No, he said. You stopped dishonor. And suddenly the entire room understood something at the exact same moment. The most important person at that table had never been the billionaire. Preston Vale looked around the table the way drowning people search for something that still floats. But the room had already abandoned him. Executives who had laughed at his jokes earlier now stared into their drinks or pretended to reread documents scattered across the polished walnut table. Nobody wanted their name attached to what was unfolding, because greed was contagious until consequences arrived. Alexander Whitmore stood slowly from his chair, adjusting the cuff of his navy suit with controlled precision. The movement was calm, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. The meeting was no longer about business expansion. It had become something far more personal. Leave the contracts on the table, Alexander said quietly to the legal assistants. Nobody touches anything. His voice carried across the room like cold steel. Preston forced another uneasy smile. Alexander, you are overreacting. Alexander finally looked directly at him again. Am I? The question landed harder than shouting ever could. Rain streaked against the glass walls behind them, while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the Manhattan skyline. The city below still glowed gold and white beneath the storm, unaware that one of Wall Street's most powerful partnerships had nearly collapsed because of betrayal sitting in a tailored suit. Naomi stepped back slightly from the table, instinctively trying to disappear again now that the truth had surfaced. But disappearing was no longer possible. Not after tonight. Kenji Nakamura folded his hands carefully in front of him and turned toward Naomi. Miss Brooks, he said softly, how did you notice the inconsistency so quickly? Every eye shifted toward her again. Naomi hesitated. She was not used to rooms like this asking for her thoughts. The wording felt wrong, she answered honestly. Japanese business language values balance. Respect. The English version sounded aggressive. Ownership instead of partnership. Kenji nodded slowly, impressed. Most executives would not have caught that. Preston scoffed bitterly under his breath. Unbelievable. Alexander heard him immediately. No, he said quietly. What is unbelievable is that the only honest person in this room tonight was the one everybody ignored. The silence that followed felt enormous. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, because praise from powerful people often arrived too late to erase what came before it. Earlier that same night, Preston had snapped his fingers at her like she was part of the furniture. Other executives had laughed while speaking about her in a language they assumed she could never understand. That was how invisibility worked. People revealed themselves around those they considered beneath them. One of the junior attorneys suddenly cleared his throat nervously. "Sir," he said toward Alexander, "if this agreement had been signed, the transfer would have become legally binding within 48 hours. The room tightened again instantly. 48 hours. That was all it would have taken for Whitmore Global to lose control of some of its most valuable technology assets. Alexander exhaled slowly through his nose while staring at the contract. Not angry anymore. Something worse. Disappointed. "How long?" he asked Preston quietly. Preston blinked. "What? How long have you been planning this?" Preston's composure cracked completely now. "You built this company on survival, Alexander. Do not act shocked because someone else learned from you." The words hung heavily in the room. Alexander absorbed them without reacting outwardly, but Naomi noticed the subtle tension forming along his jaw. Because betrayal always hurt differently when it carried a piece of truth inside it. Preston leaned forward now, desperation pushing confidence aside. "I gave 15 years to your company," he said sharply. "I made you richer while you took all the credit. So you decided to steal from me?" Alexander asked. Preston laughed bitterly. "From you? Please. Men like us do not steal. We reposition power." Naomi felt the arrogance in that sentence poison the air again. The same arrogance that believed money excused dishonesty. The same arrogance that had underestimated her from the beginning. Kenji Nakamura rose slowly from his seat then, smoothing the front of his dark suit carefully. "In my experience," he said calmly, "people who speak most about power usually understand dignity the least." Nobody answered him. They did not need to. Because at that moment, every person in the room understood exactly who had dignity tonight. And it was not the billionaire. The meeting ended without dessert. Nobody cared about the imported chocolate soufflés waiting untouched in the kitchen anymore. The Skyline room had transformed from a celebration of wealth into something colder and far more uncomfortable. Exposure. Preston Vale sat frozen at the far end of the table, while attorneys quietly gathered contracts and legal folders with tense, hurried movements. Nobody spoke to him now. That was the cruel thing about powerful rooms. Respect disappeared faster than money when fear entered the conversation. Naomi stood near the service station with her hands folded calmly in front of her apron, trying to steady the storm still moving through her chest. Adrenaline lingered beneath her skin. She had spoken when silence would have been safer, and now there was no undoing it. Alexander Whitmore remained near the windows overlooking Manhattan, one hand in his pocket, while rain streaked down the glass behind him. For several long moments, he said nothing at all. He simply stared down at the city like a man realizing how close he had come to losing everything he spent his life building. Across the room, Kenji Nakamura approached Naomi slowly. Despite the luxury surrounding them, there was something deeply humble in the older man's presence now. "Miss Brooks," he said gently, "my father used to tell me that wisdom often enters the room wearing ordinary clothes." Naomi smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. Compliments still felt unfamiliar coming from men whose watches cost more than her yearly rent. Kenji continued softly. "Tonight you protected not only a business agreement, but the honor between two companies." Naomi lowered her eyes modestly. "I only said what I thought was right." "That," Kenji replied, "is exactly why it mattered." Nearby, several executives quietly exited the private dining room without even looking toward Preston anymore. Cowardice had a smell to it. Expensive cologne mixed with fear. Preston finally stood from his chair abruptly, frustration boiling beneath the surface now that nobody remained on his side. "This is unbelievable," he snapped. "You are all acting like she is some hero because she overheard a few conversations." Alexander turned from the window slowly, calmly, but there was no warmth left in his expression anymore. "No," he said quietly. "We are acting like she saved us from a disaster you created." Preston laughed bitterly. "You think Wall Street rewards honesty? You think any billionaire gets to the top by playing fair?" Alexander walked toward the table with measured steps. "Maybe not," he admitted. "But there is a difference between ambition and betrayal." Preston shook his head in disgust. "You are only saying that because you got caught before signing." The room fell silent again. Because somewhere beneath Preston's arrogance sat an ugly truth about power itself. Men often justified corruption by claiming everyone else was already corrupt. It made dishonesty feel normal, necessary even. But Naomi understood something Preston never would. Survival, without dignity, eventually hollowed people out from the inside. Alexander stopped beside the table and looked directly at Preston. "Security will escort you downstairs," he said evenly. "Your access to Whitmore Global Accounts and Systems is terminated effective immediately." Preston stared at him in disbelief. "You cannot do this tonight." "Actually," Alexander replied softly, "I should have done it much sooner." Two hotel security staff appeared quietly near the doorway moments later. Not aggressive, professional. Preston grabbed his coat harshly from the back of his chair before storming toward the exit. But just before leaving, he turned toward Naomi one final time. His eyes burned with humiliation more than anger now. "Enjoy your moment," he said coldly. "Tomorrow nobody will remember the waitress." Naomi met his gaze steadily. Then, in flawless Japanese, she answered softly, "People always remember the person who told the truth." Preston froze. Only for a second, but it was enough. Enough for every remaining person in the room to see what arrogance looked like when it finally lost. He said nothing after that. He simply turned and disappeared through the doors while the rain continued falling over Manhattan like the city itself was trying to wash the night clean. By 11:30 that night, the Skyline room had almost emptied. Staff quietly cleared untouched plates while the soft jazz playlist continued playing as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everyone who remained inside the restaurant understood they had witnessed something impossible. Not a scandal, not a business collapse. Something rarer. A moment where truth mattered more than status. Naomi stood near the service hallway tying the strings of her black apron with slightly trembling hands. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was finally fading now, leaving exhaustion behind. Her shift should have ended an hour ago. Normally by this point, she would already be halfway downtown on the subway, earbuds in, trying not to fall asleep before her stop in Brooklyn. Instead, she was replaying the night over and over in her head. Preston's laughter. Alexander's silence. Kenji Nakamura's expression when he realized the contracts had been altered. It all felt unreal now, like something from a movie rich people watched about themselves. She reached for her coat from the employee locker when she heard footsteps approaching behind her. Naomi turned carefully. Alexander Whitmore stood alone in the hallway outside the kitchen entrance. No security team beside him. No assistants. No executives. Just a billionaire in a rain-darkened navy coat, looking strangely human beneath the fluorescent lights. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The kitchen noise echoed softly nearby. Dishes clinking. Water running. A cook laughing tiredly somewhere in the back. Ordinary sounds. The kind money could never improve. Alexander broke the silence first. "I realized something tonight," he said quietly. Naomi waited. "I spent half the evening sitting beside someone trying to destroy me." He paused briefly, and I never noticed. Naomi looked down for a second. Sometimes people only see what they expect to see. Alexander nodded slowly because the sentence hit harder than she intended. He glanced toward the dining room behind them, where employees continued cleaning expensive disasters wealthy people would never notice. "You know," he said softly, "I do not even remember if I thanked you earlier." Naomi gave a faint smile. "You had a lot happening tonight. That is not an excuse." His honesty surprised her. Most powerful men protected their pride more fiercely than their integrity. But Alexander looked genuinely unsettled now. Not by losing Preston, by realizing how blind he had been. "Preston insulted you all night," he continued quietly. "Right in front of me." Naomi stayed silent. And I said nothing. The words hung heavily between them because both understood they were true. Silence could wound people almost as deeply as cruelty itself. Naomi folded her coat carefully over her arm. "People like him usually do not expect someone like me to understand what they are saying." Alexander shook his head faintly. "That is not what bothers me most." He looked directly at her then. "What bothers me is that I did not bother to understand who you were until you saved my company." Naomi felt the sincerity in his voice immediately. No performance. No corporate polish. Just regret. Real regret. Somewhere deeper in the restaurant, thunder rolled softly beyond the windows overlooking Manhattan. The storm still had not passed. Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a business card embossed with silver lettering. Whitmore Global Capital. Chief Executive Office. Direct number handwritten on the back in black ink. He offered it to her carefully. "I would like to offer you a position at Whitmore Global," he said. Naomi blinked in surprise. "Doing what?" For the first time all night, Alexander almost smiled. "Honestly, anything you want." Naomi let out a quiet breath of disbelief. Less than 3 hours earlier, she had been carrying water glasses while executives mocked her existence in a language they thought she could never understand. Now one of the most powerful men in New York stood in a service hallway, asking her to help shape the future of his company. Life changed fast when truth entered the room. Naomi looked at the card, but did not take it immediately. "You barely know me," she said softly. Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. "No," he replied quietly. "Tonight, I think I finally started paying attention." Naomi stared at the business card in Alexander Whitmore's hand while rainwater crawled slowly down the restaurant windows behind him. Somewhere outside, Manhattan traffic still moved through the storm, millions of people rushing past one another without realizing how quickly a single night could rewrite someone's future. The fluorescent lights above the service hallway buzzed softly while cooks finished cleaning the kitchen for closing. Everything around them felt strangely ordinary for a moment that was changing both of their lives. Naomi finally accepted the card carefully between her fingers. Thick white paper, silver lettering, heavy enough to feel expensive, the kind of card people saved instead of throwing away. She looked down at the handwritten phone number on the back and let out a quiet breath. "You really mean this?" she asked softly. Alexander nodded without hesitation. "I do." Naomi studied him for a second longer. Earlier that evening, he had looked untouchable, another billionaire wrapped in expensive fabric and corporate confidence. But now he simply looked tired, human, like someone confronting the cost of trusting the wrong people for too long. "Most people only offer opportunities after they know someone's resume," Naomi said quietly. Alexander glanced toward the dining room, where legal teams still sorted through contracts under dim golden lights. "Tonight, I learned resumes do not always reveal character." The sentence settled between them gently. Honest. Naomi thought about all the applications she had sent over the years. Jobs she never got. Interviews that ended the moment executives saw her face or heard her Brooklyn accent. Doors that quietly closed while less qualified people walked straight through them. The world had spent years teaching her that intelligence only impressed people after it arrived wrapped in the right skin color, the right zip code, the right last name. Tonight had been different. Not because wealthy people suddenly became kind, but because truth had forced them to see her before they could dismiss her. Alexander slipped his hands into his coat pockets and looked at her carefully. "Can I ask you something?" Naomi nodded slightly. "Why did you help me?" The question caught her off guard because it carried no ego inside it. Just genuine confusion. Naomi leaned lightly against the hallway wall, exhausted now in the deepest possible way. "Because Mrs. Sato used to tell me something when I was little," she said quietly. "She said if you stay silent while someone is being deceived, eventually you become part of the deception too." Alexander absorbed the words slowly. Naomi continued softly, "And honestly, I almost said nothing." That surprised him. "Why?" She gave a faint, tired smile. "Because people like me learn very early that speaking up can cost you everything." The kitchen staff passed behind them carrying trays and stacked dishes toward the sinks, barely noticing the billionaire standing in the hallway. Naomi watched them disappear through the swinging doors. "Most nights," she said, "being invisible feels safer." Alexander lowered his eyes briefly because he finally understood what she meant. Safety and silence often traveled together for people without power. But silence also protected men like Preston. "Well," he said quietly after a long pause, "tonight you were the bravest person in the building." Naomi laughed softly under her breath. Not because she disagreed, because nobody had ever called her brave before. Outside, the rain finally began slowing, leaving streaks of water shimmering against the glass skyline. The storm was passing. Alexander glanced toward the elevators, then back at Naomi. "Whatever you decide about the job offer," he said sincerely, "thank you." Naomi looked down at the business card once more before slipping it carefully into her coat pocket. Then she lifted her eyes toward him with calm confidence. "Next time," she said softly, "pay attention before the disaster starts." For the first time all night, Alexander Whitmore smiled without calculation or control behind it. A real smile. Small but real. Naomi turned then and walked toward the employee exit beneath the dim hallway lights, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. Nobody stopped her. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked through her anymore. Because the woman they ignored at dinner had walked into the room carrying nothing but a tray of glasses and walked out with something far more powerful than money. Respect. And somewhere high above Manhattan, Beneath the fading storm clouds and city lights, a billionaire finally learned that the most dangerous thing in the world is underestimating someone whose worth you never bothered to see.